Okay, Madam Chair, we're ready to begin the meeting.
Welcome. It is 5:30 p.m. and I am calling the July 6, 2021 meeting of the Historic Site Preservation Board to order. Please silence any cell phones or barking dogs or whatever. May we please have the roll call?
Yes, good evening, Madam Chair. Member Rosenau?
Here.
Member Rose is not here yet, looks like, right? Member Miller?
Yes, here.
Member Kaiser?
Here.
Member Hanson?
Here.
Member Dixon?
Present.
Vice Chair Nelson?
Present.
And Chair Hoff.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Very good. So we want to welcome Stephen Rose when he does appear. But in the meanwhile, can we thank Member Dixon for her past service over the many years, always bringing wonderful questions and good insight into all the projects. And we want to thank Linda, and please join me others in thanking Linda for your wonderful, wonderful service. It's been a delight.
We're on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Do I have the floor?
Yes, yes, Linda.
Well, it's been an exciting time for me to serve 2 years on the HSPB board. The staff, former board members, and this current board has really taught me a lot about preservation, and I truly appreciate the passion and the commitment by both board and staff in their efforts to continue to protect Palm Springs past. I want to thank Ken. I want to thank Flynn and Joanne for all their hard work. I want to say thank you to the former city council members and the current city council members for supporting the actions that this board has taken. I know that this board will continue to ask good questions and work hard to preserve Palm Springs architectural history, and my best to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member Dixon, and hope you'll visit us from time to time.
I will.
Because we enjoy having your participation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Linda.
Thank you. With that, sayonara.
Super. So may we please have the staff report on the posting of the agenda?
Yes, the agenda for this meeting was posted for public review at the City Hall Bulletin Board on the west side of the council chamber and the planning department counter in accordance with the state law.
Good. Does the board have any revisions to the agenda? Okay, so acceptance of the agenda. May I have a motion to approve the agenda as presented?
Motion to approve agenda as presented.
Okay.
Second.
Second by, okay, so we have a motion by Mr. Miller and a second by Mr. Kaiser. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, I call the question. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And any opposed? So the motion passes 6-0. Okay, so public comment. This time has been set aside for members of the public to address the Historic Site Preservation Board on agenda items and items of general interest within the subject matter of this board. Although the Historic Site Preservation Board values your comments, pursuant to the Brown Act, it generally cannot take any action on items not listed on the posted agenda. There will be 3 minutes assigned for each speaker. A testimony for public hearing will be taken at the time of the hearing. Mr. Lyon, has anyone requested to comment on a non-public hearing item or an item that is not on today's agenda?
We've gotten no notice from anybody who was contacting us wishing to speak. I do see that we have several individuals. Planning Commissioner Maruzzi has turned on his camera, so I believe he may want to speak during public comment.
Okay, Mr. Maruzzi, would you like?
Well, hi, everybody. Yes, I'm representing the Palm Springs Modern Committee, an agenda item 4A regarding the Security National Bank. It's an extremely important mid-century modern building that was built in '59 by Mr. Wong, and we really strongly support the idea that the HSPB take it under consideration, do the review, do what's necessary, have a site visit, and strongly consider it for Class 1 historic site status. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Maruzzi. Do we have any other speakers that wish to speak at this time?
If anybody else who is here in the meeting right now who does wish to speak, would you please turn your camera on?
This is Jeff Piper.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay.
I was just going to introduce you. Jeff Piper is here representing the ownership of the 500 South Indian Canyon Drive building.
We just want to confirm that we're going to have an opportunity to talk at when the 4A comes up on your agenda.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, then we'll mute until then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Anybody else wishing to speak who's here in the meeting, please turn your camera on. Seeing none, that looks like the conclusion of public comment, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. We will proceed to the consent agenda for the June 1st meeting, June 1st, 2021. Are there any revisions to the minutes of that meeting of June 1st, 2021? Everybody's read them. Okay. It was good minutes, by the way.
Thank you.
May I have a motion to approve the minutes of June 1, 2021?
I'll move.
Okay, thank you.
Second.
Okay, second. I have a motion by member Rosenau and a second by Mr. Nelson. And is there any discussion about the minutes? Seeing none, I will call for the question. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So motion passes. Is there six? 6-0. Thank you. Let's proceed to agenda item 2A, public hearings. An application by Michael Johnston and David Zippel, owners for historic designation of the Goldberg residence located in Southbridge Drive. Mr. Lyons, is there a report?
Yes, Madam Chair, there is. I will briefly summarize the staff report. As noted in your staff report, this is a building that was built and designed in 1962 by renowned architect William Cody. The home reflects the post-World War II period in Palm Springs and is a notable example of the work of Cody. The analysis of this project was done by a consultant. The report was provided to you earlier, and all of you have had a tour of the site in question. The analysis of this particular project against the criteria for historic designation begins in your staff report on page 4. And there it is identified that the site primarily qualifies because it reflects the mid-century modern period in Palm Springs, which is under criterion 3. It also represents a very distinctive characteristics in terms of its method of construction. As noted in your staff report on page 4, Cody's early work resembled some of his experience when relative to like a Taliesin type of organic architecture, which you can see in his Del Marcos Hotel. At Goldberg, however, he took a completely different departure and was really at the time when he was beginning to really play with the idea of a very extreme thinness in the structural elements of the building. And this particular building would not have been possible for this kind of very thin roofline expression without bringing in the material of steel in order to carry those spans with such a very thin roof profile. So the identifying characteristic on this for criterion 4 is that it embodies a particular distinctive method of construction. It also is identified under criterion 5 as a significant piece of work by master architect William Cody. Beginning on page 7 of the Historic Resources Report, Cody's architectural career has been documented. His work was very influential, and his first independent work in Palm Springs, as noted, was the Del Marcos Hotel in 1947. There are many other buildings that we see in the desert: the Horizon Hotel, Springs Restaurant, which is now demolished, the El Dorado Country Club, Racket Club Cottages West, the Abernathy Residence, also 1962, the Tramway Shell gas station, the Glass House, referred to as the Camino Norte House, St. Teresa's Catholic Church, and the Palm Springs Public Library Center, which was done in 1973. His work has helped define what has become known as desert modern architecture, and he continues to be recognized for his architectural talent and versatility. And so therefore, the Goldberg residence qualifies as a historic resource under criterion 5. It does not identify any others in the report, only those 3. The analysis of integrity begins on page 5 of your staff report. And as noted in these various categories, also onto page 6 and 7, this building does possess a very high level of architectural integrity and historic integrity. The design is pretty much as you would have recognized it from 1962. The current owners have done a very careful restoration and restored many of the features of the home that had been kind of heavy-handedly remodeled over time. It is acknowledged on page 6 of your staff report. On the back side of the home, there have been some modifications made, including an addition to the master bathroom, and which the finishes, however, on the exterior are matching that of the existing facade. In 2020, there was a unique glazed corner window also put into that backside that was reflected in the construction drawings, but with the current owner, they were able to make that corner with a buttless frame kind of glass. In addition, an addition made, at the southwest corner of the home expanded one of the bedrooms. However, most of the alterations, as noted, are minimal, and their impact has not adversely affected the integrity. So the home does retain a high degree of historic integrity. On page 7, we've listed what are the character-defining features of this particular property. The non-contributing features which have been identified are the various additions to the home, which are documented through building permits and the record that we have in the Historic Resources Report, the landscaping, and the fountain at the entry adjacent to the carport. That concludes my staff report. Robert Imboden, who is the author of the Historic Resources Report, is here and can speak further to this particular project. I'm available to answer any questions you may have, and this is a public hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Lyon. Does the board have any questions for staff at this time? Any questions, anyone? Member Nelson, undo your mute.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Hop. I just have 2 or 3 minor things that I found on the staff report. The first item is on page 5 of 8. The first paragraph, third sentence. When speaking about Cliff May, I believe instead of saying building and designer, it should simply say building designer. So
Yes,
the and is erroneous.
thank you.
And then on page 7 of 8, under defining historic characteristics, item 6, the word planar is probably most likely spelled with an A rather than an E.
And maybe
Planar instead of planar. And just a question under non-contributing elements, is the reason why the pool was not included?
No, there's no reason why the pool wasn't included. There was a pool in that location. This is a replacement pool that has been oriented in a different way, but there was a pool there, so it could be added to the non-contributing if you wish, yes.
Okay, and one last thing before it opens up is that the applicant had mentioned during the HSPB members site visit that they were interested in having the marker at the end of the carport. So probably somewhere closer to the house rather than on the wall facing the street, just to invite people to get a little closer. So just wanted to make that point of clarification.
We'll coordinate that with the owner. We do make sure that the plaques are visible from the public way so people don't have to enter upon the property, but I will coordinate that with the building owner.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Does the board have any other questions for staff at this point? Any other question? Okay. So seeing no further questions of the staff, I will open the public hearing. And I understand the applicant would like to speak. So I would like to welcome Robert M. Bowden to speak. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about your application or the property? Please give your name and your address, and you have 10 minutes to present and 2 minutes of rebuttal if desired after public comments. So may I welcome you, Mr. Bowden?
Yes, thank you. And thank you to the commission for hearing this item this evening. I don't have a long formal presentation to give to you. I think that Mr. Lyon's staff report did a pretty good job of outlining everything that was included in the report. And it sounds as though all of you were able to make it up to the house. And certainly I think you feel the significance of that property just by visiting it alone. I think that the current owners have also done a really excellent job of returning many of the changes that occurred over time and either restoring them back to their original condition or replacing them with suitable replacements that maintain the integrity of the home. As Ken outlined, the house it's not unique within Cody's work. Certainly there are other properties that are similar, but this very streamlined international style, very formal, the very thin nature of the house is undoubtedly pronounced in this house, and I think exposes a very unique time and moment within Cody's career. So I do think that it's worth the city to recognize that and to do anything we can to help preserve that. So as I say, I don't have a long formal presentation because I think you've been given enough information already. I absolutely am here to answer any questions that you might have. I'd be happy to do that.
Is there anyone else in the audience who wishes to speak in a public comment on this item? Any other names, Mr. Lyons, have been submitted to speak on this or not?
No.
Nope. Okay. Seeing no further speakers on this item, then I will close the public hearing. And now the action is with the board for discussion. And I see that Mr. Rose, yes, Ken?
I wanted to just acknowledge that Stephen Rose has joined us. Stephen, welcome to the HSPB. And Madam Chair, I just want to inform the board that Stephen did receive the packet and he has received the Historic Resources Report for the Goldberg residence. So the only thing that he was not able to participate in because his nomination and appointment was just made last week is he was not able to actually visit the site.
Okay. So Mr. Rose, undo your mute. And on behalf of the board, like to welcome you officially to this meeting. And I didn't know if you wanted to say a word or two about yourself, your background, so we are all acquainted with you. Just a moment.
Sure. I was born a poor child. No, I'm kidding. I'm from the Midwest, and I've been in California for many years. I had a career in Los Angeles, but during that time, as well as here, my passion has always been architecture, and I'm honored to be a part of the board. And I have been at the Goldberg House a few times, I would say. And I think it's probably one of the finest examples of the beauty of resolving preservation and renovation. And I think that the owners have done a spectacular job in that regard.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Rose. So now the action is with the board on the Goldberg residence. And I would like to ask if there are further discussion, questions, comments of anybody. Member Hanson?
Yeah, I just have a question. I agree with board member Nelson that the pool should be non-contributing. Do we need to include that in the motion, or will that be included just by virtue of this discussion?
I would prefer that you include that in the motion that it's made that identifies that as an additional non-contributing item. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or discussion points? Anyone or questions? Anybody? Okay. Okay. So, Mr. Nelson.
Being none, I'll go ahead and make the motion if that's okay.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
I so move that the Pumpkin Historic Site Preservation Board make the formal motion to nominate the resident, the Goldberg resident, located at 2340 Southridge Drive, as a Class 1 historic site, with the proviso or amendment that the pool be added to the non-contributing features.
Very good. May I have a second to that motion?
A second.
Member Hanson. So I have a motion by member Nelson and a second by member Hanson. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, I will call the question. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion passes 7-0. So moving on to number 3, unfinished business. There is no unfinished business. So let us proceed to agenda new business item 4A, City of Palm Springs for possible historic designation of Security First National Bank located at 500 South Indian Canyon Drive. May we please have a staff report?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. As noted in the memo in your packet, this meeting or this item was considered at the June meeting to be added to your annual work plan. And at the June meeting, the board did vote to include the Security First National Bank on your work plan for the current year, identifying it as priority 3 in the list and moving the fire station number 4 to next year's or a subsequent year's work plan. So at today's meeting, we would like to have the board give us direction to initiate the processing of the application for possible historic designation, including setting up site visits of the board to the site and scheduling a public hearing of the board to consider the application.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Lyon. Does the board have any questions of staff before we proceed? Any questions? Okay, I understand that we have a representative from the Security First National Bank who wishes to speak. Mr. Rosenau, undo your mute.
Mr. Rosenau.
I'm sorry, since this is not a public hearing, we should probably save his comments for that down the road. This is simply just to put it back onto our agenda, our work plan.
Okay, you prefer discussing before we have Mr. Piper speak to us? Do you prefer to speak in advance?
I'm sorry, are you asking for the owners?
Okay, Mr. Lyon, shall we have further discussion before we invite Mr. Piper to present?
If you don't mind,
I would
we're down
think
to
it's
3%
appropriate to have
battery.
Mr. Piper speak now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we welcome Jeff Piper. You have 3 minutes if you would like to share anything more about the project for the board's consideration.
I would appreciate that. Thank you for your time. Just so you know, I have Dan Wynn, which is another one of the owners as well with me. We have just under 3% battery, so this is going to go very quick for us as well. So we're going to go from our part. So for me personally, I understand what you guys are doing. We talked to the third party who came with this idea, and they came to us and they said, "Are you guys interested?" And we said no. And it's not because we have any intention of doing anything. We just know it sucks all the value out of the property and it destroys all the things we've worked for. So because of that, we told them no. Then they handed off to you guys. You are now taking the third party's information. And so we're just expecting that if you guys are going to go down this path, that you guys have to do your own research into this process and make sure that it's going properly and giving us proper amount of time to look at it and see what we can do, because we're 100% against this. We have no plans to do anything with the property. But again, the value of the property is enormously negatively affected because of what this is going to happen to us. So my lawyers are saying that you guys have to follow your own process, and your process is the third party cannot put forward a request for a historical designation without the owners being on board, and we are not on board. So you guys, if you guys are going to take this under your own wing, you guys have to spend your own money and do your own research to do that. And then we'll see where we go down that path. So thank you very much. We just, again, we're not trying to do anything, but we just don't want to lose all the value in the property. I'm going to end my 3 minutes. Do you mind if we go straight to Dan before we run out of battery?
Yes, please proceed.
Well, thank you. This is Dan Wynn. I'm one of the owners. And I am very, very perplexed by what's going on. This is my life saving. And this is what I'm saving to invest for my retirement. I'm against this, and I'm very perplexed by the fact that a third party would have the authority and would have a say on something that we absolutely against. I don't understand how this process worked, but quite frankly, there should have been more involve us as part of the process, but we are just, I feel like this is something that's been jamming down our throats, either take this or else. I came from a place where I'm a first generation immigrant here. I have seen this many times before in Vietnam when I grew up, when the government extend their authority and taking over property, and I'm absolutely against it. And so I respectfully ask that the board take the time and do your own due diligence and work with us to come up with a common ground what this is all about, but I'm absolutely against it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Piper and Mr. Wynn, for your passionate comments. We really appreciate your giving us your comments and allowing us to review this issue and your property and how meaningful it is, you know, to the city of Palm Springs. I would like to invite some discussion amongst the board and staff. Who would like to make a comment?
And I'm sorry, and just so you know, when we drop here in 1 second, it's not because we're not interested, it's just we have no more phone battery. So we will watch the whole video later, and then we'll discuss it with our side as well. Thank you very much for your consideration, and thank you for doing hopefully the right thing.
Thank you, Mr. Piper. So, so who would like to speak first? Member Hanson?
I actually don't need to speak, but Mr. Lyon, could you clarify this process per the ordinance, just to clarify for us, and I think also the property owners? There was maybe a few misconceptions about how this proceeds from here.
Yes, I'll try. As you know, this initially was initiated by the Palm Springs Preservation Foundation, and they sought owner support. They were unable to gain owner support. They approached the board by writing a letter asking the board to take this on as one of the board's work plan priorities. And that is what you did at the last meeting. Now, the board at this point has taken this on, and you've added it to your work plan. And the motion that you will take today on this item, if you choose to do so, is, as I mentioned in our recommendation that's in your staff memo. In terms of where the board obtains its information relative to an application, there is nothing in the ordinance that specifically identifies from where or from whom the board may get this information. It may be wise for the board to review the material and substantiate the assertions that are made in the report, but ultimately you will be adopting the information in that report based on your findings that you make about this building at the public hearing. So at this time, this is not a public hearing, and you are not considering the merits of this case at this time. All you are doing at this time is directing us to move forward with the application that you put on your work plan.
So in terms of the meeting last week, today, I mean, the word in the recommendation is to formalize. So I think, did we not take a vote last time, or how is this process different from what we did at the last meeting?
The vote that you took at the last meeting was to actually amend your work plan. So
Okay,
you amended the work plan and brought this particular site onto your work plan priorities for this particular year. What the action is before you today is to actually direct staff to initiate that processing, including the scheduling of site visits and the scheduling of a public hearing.
okay, thank you.
Okay. So, Mr. Rose?
So basically all we're doing here is we are enabling staff to study it, correct?
Yes.
That's how we're beginning.
That's simple enough, works for me.
So we're initiating the application and asking the opportunity to visit the site, to have the opportunity to research and look at it. And then that would be followed, with a public hearing. So this is just beginning the review process, as I understand it. Is that correct, Mr. Lyon?
That is correct.
We're beginning the research. So are there any other points that anybody or question? Member Nelson?
Yeah, so just one more point of clarification for staff. Because we have made this part of our work plan, we required, or is it absolutely necessary, or both, to initiate a new report that comes from the city rather than adopting the report that was done by the Preservation Foundation?
No, you're only initiating the action to begin processing the report and processing, the application. There's nothing in the ordinance that says that this has to be something that's written or produced by any particular individual or body.
Great. So in other words, we don't need to expend any of our budget to write or research additional reports for this particular property.
Well, it is something that you might want to consider actually taking a look at and doing potentially a further review of the material that's in the historic resources report that's been provided to you to substantiate that, in fact, the findings and the criteria, evaluations and assertions therein are factual and ones that the city would agree with. You could do that.
Thank you. I have just one more thing to add, that's informational for the board and anyone who's watching. The current tenant of the building is Union Bank, and they signed their lease in January of 2015. And it's a 10-year lease, which is up in January of 2025. So they will be a tenant for at least 3.5 more years, just as an FYI.
Very good. Thank you. Any other discussion on this matter? Okay, Mr. Rose?
Yeah, I understand the passion of the owners, but I think at this point, it's all we're doing is studying the building. So
Correct.
not offering any opinions or solutions at this point, just studying it.
Mhm. So may I have a motion to that effect?
I'll move.
Okay. Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
Okay, very good. So we have a motion by Mr. Rosenau and a second by Mr. Rose. Is there any other discussion on the motion? Okay, I'll call for the question. All in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion passes 7-0. Thank you. Let us proceed to agenda item 4B, the Illuminaire House Foundation on behalf of the Palm Springs Art Museum requesting approval for alterations to the Palm Springs Art Museum, a Class 1 historic site located on Museum Drive. Mr. Lyon, may we please have a report?
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. As noted in your staff report, this had been reviewed by the HSPB for the concept of placing the Illuminaire House on the site of the Palm Springs Art Museum, which is a Class 1 historic site. So the process that you are considering here is a certificate of appropriateness for alterations to the site, which is the Palm Springs Art Museum, a Class 1 historic site. The project before you is the actual design development, if you will, of the sculpture garden that is proposed on the south end of the Art Museum's parcel. It's in what is currently the south parking lot of the museum. And as noted in your staff report on page 3, you can see that there are approximately 27 parking spaces that will be eliminated in order to create this sculpture garden. And on the bottom of page 3 is the conceptual design of the sculpture garden. On page 4 of your staff report is a photo simulation which shows the current parking lot and then the Illuminaire House and its proposed placement. And the project as it's described in the material from the applicant is beginning on page 5 of your staff report. The sculpture garden is approximately 90 to 95 feet square, surrounded by a 44-inch high unpainted rubbed concrete wall, portion of which is the south wall is just still existing. 3 6-foot wide pedestrian gates are proposed on one side, on the south, east, and north sides of the garden. The north and south gates are aligned with quote unquote driveway strips, which lead to the Illuminaire House garage simulating a 1930s driveway. The ground plane within the perimeter wall proposed in 3/8-inch crushed rock with a perimeter walkway and an event staging area of standard gray concrete. The drawings denote the inert ground cover to either be Mojave gold or a graphite, which is a gray color. Between the perimeter wall and the concrete walkway are a row of plantings denoted as being natal palm or artichoke agave. Along the Tockwitz Canyon parcel are a row of desert spoon plants and 4 large date palm trees. The existing trees and the shrubs that are there now are proposed for removal. The analysis of off-street parking. I think some of the questions that the board had at your the last meeting where the concept of this was considered were some questions about parking. So I note that at the bottom of the staff report that according to the city's parking ordinance, the Palm Springs Art Museum site, in order to propose the location of this sculpture garden, is exempt from having to provide additional parking spaces for an intensified use. However, in this case, the proposal is actually removing parking spaces. So currently the museum has about 43 spaces in the south lot and 94 in the north lot for a total of 137. On the top of page 6, you will note in 1994, the council approved a plan development district in which it determined that 146 off-street spaces were adequate for the mix of uses therein. And in 95, the council approved to change the zone for the museum campus from central business district to plan development number 230. And also noted in 95, the museum added the 25,000 square foot of gallery and other spaces So that the current total art museum, according to their website, has approximately 124,000 square feet of a mix of uses, including galleries, the museum store, a cafe, classrooms, a 90-seat lecture hall, 433-seat auditorium, sculpture garden, warehouse, and offices. In addition to the on-site parking that exists, the museum also has available parking in the city's garage, which is across the street from the Palm Springs Art Museum, where there is over 1,000 parking spaces available. And there's also on-street parking spaces on most of the public streets surrounding the museum. In summary, although the current proposed alteration of the museum campus requires the removal of 27 parking spaces, staff believes there is still adequate amount of parking on site and in the vicinity to accommodate the parking needs for the museum. The analysis of this application and this alteration to the site is beginning on page 6 as well. And there you will see how we have basically looked at the possibility of how this proposed introduction of the Illuminaire House onto the museum site may or may not impact the museum site. And certainly in terms of the open space around the museum, this does represent a modification of that. But as we've noted in the staff report, we believe that the museum is not materially impaired and the historic defining characteristics are not adversely affected by this proposal. The museum is still fully visible from all streets from which it takes access, as well as the new main east-west street that was created as part of the downtown redevelopment plan. So we believe that the findings in order to grant a certificate of appropriateness for this project can be affirmatively met, and that is our recommendation. I'm available for any further questions you may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lyon. So I'd like to begin now with questions that the board might have of the staff. And I would like to begin with a question. Do we have to have those 16 parking places? I understand the numbers in your report and that you feel there's sufficient parking, especially with the parking across the street from the city's public parking lot. So the 16, I don't know, I was trying to do the math real fast, but there's not very many parking spaces in the south parking lot. And I'm not particularly in favor of having that very small number of parking between the two buildings. To me, it's with this addition, it's a visual noisy area for me, and I don't particularly like having that small number of parking spaces located between the two buildings and within that garden. And so my question is it required to have parking in the south parking lot?
Well, it's not required to have parking in the south parking lot per se, but what the goal of the museum's project here has been to minimize the reduction of on-site parking spaces as much as possible in order to accommodate the sculpture garden for the Illuminaire House. We have not done an analysis of the project. If all of the parking spaces in the south parking lot were to be eliminated, we would begin to have some concerns. I know it's only 16 as you count, but the museum, with the number of spaces that it has, does also, of course, rely on street parking and parking in the city parking structure across the street. So we believe that while this certainly does represent a reduction in terms of the on-site parking spaces, we would not recommend complete removal of on-site parking spaces in the south lot because we feel that there is still a need for parking, and to the extent that they can accommodate as many as possible on site, that would be our recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Lyon, for explaining that.
Mr. Lyon, this is Tracy Conrad. Could I comment?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Chairman. Hi. You know, the idea of leaving the parking places came out of deference to the city. I don't know that parking is necessarily the purview of the HSPB. I think the museum would be amenable to, and certainly the Illuminaire Foundation would be amenable to studying what it might be if you wanted a further expansion of the sculpture garden down the road. And a lot of the reason why the site design left those parking places is because they are predominantly handicapped spaces. So Mr. Lyons is his concern is well founded for that reason. And that was the rationale behind that site plan.
Okay. Are there any other questions of staff? Member Kaiser?
I just have a question. Because of the size of the Illuminaire house is so much smaller, how did this become a 95-foot by 95-foot piece of property? And I don't also understand why it's walled. This house has never been in a walled situation. I mean, I don't understand the rationale design-wise of where they're going with what they're intending to do with this house. It's like being isolated when it never was before.
Mr. Lyon?
Perhaps Ms. Conrad can further elaborate on that.
I'm delighted, and I'm very grateful that Mr. Lyon invited me to the meeting to be able to answer some of these questions. And I thank you all very much for your previous review in last September. You know, the Illuminaire is a siteless building. It was originally a display house that was inside another building, and 100,000 people walked through it in the time of a month. It is not. It's never had a site that has been specific, and the museum desired to have the Illuminaire within its orbit for obvious reasons, because of how important Albert Frey has been to Palm Springs and the museum in particular. And so the idea of security, given what's going on downtown and the intensity of other uses that are surrounding, requires some sort of security and limit of access that when to be close to it, with docents, rather than just be able to walk right up to it at all times of the day or night. And the architects that have shepherded this project for 30 years, worked intensively on this site plan and are satisfied with it. They were very much wanted it to be in the orbit of the museum. You all may recall from our conversation back in September that College of the Desert was also keenly interested in having the Illuminaire on its West Valley campus. So, I'm sure we could all site plan it in various ways. This is what the architects and the museum have come up with.
Okay. So it's understanding that, the wall and the three gates, most likely the gates would be locked, perhaps when the museum is closed. So it sounds like the intent of the walls and the gates are to protect the building when the museum is closed. Is that kind of a general understanding?
Very much, yes, very much so. Given the neighborhood and all of the things that are ongoing, the museum has a responsibility to protect the building, and they want to bring people to it in a way that is curated, to choose a word. Catherine.
And I understand, the museum's mission and values to protect their collections, and while providing access to the collections, to a collection item, but then yet protecting it and meeting the standards for that as well. So I understand that. Are there other points, questions? Did Mr. Kaiser, did I see your hand earlier, or Mr. Nelson?
I would really like to hear from the architects and who was on this museum board that came up with this plan. Because I really don't, this is what has been presented to us without any further input that this is the best solution to it. And to me, it doesn't look like it is.
Well, I would just say, if I may, that when we presented to you in September, the certificate of appropriateness was granted, and it was a condition, was it not, Mr. Lyon, that we just come back to you with a more finalized landscape plan. And I thought that's what we're doing now.
That is correct. The concept of placement of the house on this end of the museum campus was what your certificate of appropriateness granted in the September meeting. This meeting and the evaluation today is to understand the actual design of the sculpture garden as it's been designed, and determine whether the design of the sculpture garden is appropriate within the context of the museum.
Mr. Nelson?
Yeah, while we're on questions for staff, I just want to go back to the earlier discussion regarding parking. And I would say I would have to agree with Tracy Conrad about parking not necessarily being under HSPB purview, although the architect's intent was to have these two open spaces on both the north and south side of the building for breathing room and for sightlines. So my question for staff then is, does this go before the Planning Commission because of the fact that the parking lot is being altered and changed, and there are issues around that?
I am not aware that this has a requirement to go to the Planning Commission. Director Fagg is still with us here. I don't know if he has further comment on that, but it was not my understanding that this needed further review by the Planning Commission.
Mr.
Director
Lyon,
Fagg, do you want to add anything to that?
you're correct. It does not need to go to Planning Commission based on the nature of the application and the scope of work that's proposed.
Yeah, so thank you for answering that. And if I may, since I have the floor, I have a whole list of things that I've written out that I'm very concerned about with this application. So you'll have to bear with me because I really studied it. I went to the site today, spent a lot of time there, walked around, looked at maps, did everything I could possibly do. And so I would ask a favor of the applicant, Ms. Conrad, to just hear me out on this. And there are several questions within each paragraph. You could just make note of them and then maybe give answers at the very end and just let me go through the whole thing. So I'll start off. It's about 6 or 7 paragraphs. Contrary to the staff findings, I personally feel the existing rubbed concrete wall on the south side may be construed as a character defining feature, since it matches other existing walls on the site, making it part of the architectural language of the original material used. My question here is, will the 3 new walls be unpainted rubbed concrete as stated in the staff report and made to match the existing south wall, or will they in fact be concrete block as stated on the plan? Next point, is the Illuminaire house itself meant to be showcased as a piece of art, or in other words, to be the main sculpture within this new quote unquote sculpture garden? If so, it really ought to be lit up. Nothing attracts vagrants and vandalism like an enclosed dark space. That being said, I would suggest that the boulders proposed in front of the perimeter wall be moved further away from the wall, so as not to enable people to more easily jump over the low 3.5-foot wall. Will there be sculpture pieces placed within these walls? If so, will they go on the graveled areas? For the landscaping along the inside of the wall, it is my opinion that rather than using all of the same of one plant material, natal plum might be best along 2 sides, the west and the south, to add more color, height, and interest. On the east and north side, it would get too much afternoon sun and likely burn, so the artichoke agave would be better there on the east and north side, because on the plan it stipulates either or natal plum or artichoke agave. I think you could do both, depending on the sun patterns and the radiant heat from the wall. Next point, if the flagpoles are being removed, where are they being moved to? And since they are being removed from their present location, why not move the semicircular seating area in front of them? It is certainly outdated, and the current color and design of it will not complement the proposed theme. What I mean by outdated is that there's a plaque there in the sidewalk and also a marker, both of which say Palm Springs Desert Museum, and it's talking about the old context of the museum as a natural sciences desert-oriented museum and not as a world-class art museum. Next point, due to the gray nature of the structure and the proposed gray concrete pavers, as well as the proposed gray concrete black wall or rub concrete, it seems that a Mojave gold gravel would provide some contrast and be more in keeping with Frey's tendency to use materials and finishes that complement the local flora. Gray on gray on gray seems to me like it would be somber and anathema to Frey's penchant for natural color. That gray color scheme reminds me of when I visited a place called the Museum of Terror, a memorial to victims of terror in Hungary. I think Frey would probably prefer something more happy that recalls the excitement of how Illuminaire was, quote unquote, an overnight sensation that emboldened an architectural movement. Next point. There are currently 2 lollipop lights, both at the southwest and southeast corners of this site. Will they both remain? Also, a large gumdrop light that is to be removed in the parking area where the spaces are being eliminated. Will that gumdrop light be saved and placed further to the north to mirror the one that will stay? And my final point. There's a small mesquite tree in the back along the western side near the service entry to the museum, which according to the plan will stay. I noticed today that mesquite tree produces a lot of beans, which this time of year tend to fall and create a huge mess. If that point is going to become an entry exit for vehicles, as it shows on the plan, those beans will get crushed and create a huge mess. So I would suggest removing the tree or making sure it's kept pruned and cleaned at all times. Furthermore, is that point of entry going to be expanded to better accommodate vehicular access? Because right now it doesn't look wide enough to accommodate a vehicle driving in and out of there. And while I'm on that note, it seems troublesome to me that that back area to the west of the 90 by 95 plot is going to be curbed off on the north side, and it's only going to have what appears to be 4 parking spaces, which I assume would be for staff or docents or whomever is working at the Illuminaire house. It seems very tight back there. And I did also note on the west side of that little area that there's a culvert for drainage. And so that's why in the plan, it looks like there's 2 1/4 parking spaces. So that little dotted line just behind the wall looks like it's drainage or that culvert that goes out to the sidewalk. So that's everything that I saw and wanted to bring up. And I hope that the staff and the applicant will appreciate those things and be able to answer some of my concerns. Thank you.
Okay, I took notes. Gee whiz, Jade. I will do my best. and then Mr. Lyons can, Mr. Lyon can correct me, but the wall, you're correct that it's drawn on the plan as block. And if the HSPB wants us to have it to match, we can do that. You know, the Secretary of the Interior standards say that you usually want to read a difference between what is new and original, but we will certainly defer to the HSPB's recommendation as per whatever your conditions are after this meeting. In terms of lighting the building, I think that we certainly could light the building. Also, this falls under the same idea that if you want to recommend that the building be lighted, the idea that it is a sculpture is exactly what we are thinking, and that the museum would program the remainder of the space to have other sculptures. But the idea was that there would be plenty of space around it to be able to stand back, to be able to appreciate the building from all facades of the building. Natal plum and artichoke agave, the reason it's non-specific is because it'll depend on what plant material we can get And in terms of the mesquite tree, I, generally am want to kill any sort of tree, so we could certainly keep that keep that in good trim repair. The idea to have some shade is what from the south is what the planting plan is about. And the HSPB's recommendation regarding preference of plant material is also we'd be happy to accept. I agree with you about I personally agree with you about the semicircular seating and the flagpole thing, that it's just a kind of a weirdness that was installed when they were first thinking about bike paths all over the city. I think it dates to about 25 years ago. It's not original. I'd be delighted to have your recommendation include removing it. As would, I think, the Illuminaire Foundation. I can't speak for the museum, but if the HSPB feels strongly that there should be no parking places over there, that certainly is a recommendation that you could make, and we could work with staff to decide how the future sculpture garden would lay out. And it would give more breathing room. It would make it easier to negotiate, wouldn't have to deal with that opening in the wall to provide vehicular access that you were speaking about at the end. And in terms of the decomposed granite, Mojave Gold is an excellent suggestion. And, Albert Frey had light yellow curtains up in the Frey 2 house. He very much liked desert colors. I'm not a big fan of gray myself. And I think we're trying to just be simple. And we can certainly also take your suggestion that there be some color that relates to the organic and rich earth tones of the museum itself, and is not in such stark contrast. The building obviously is aluminum, so it will provide its own amount of contrast as a sculpture would. The lollipop lights and the gumdrop lights, we can save and reposition. Some of this, will have to happen on site as a design build kind of project, because we're going to run into some issues, I'm sure, as we try and implement the plan. And then in terms of the water drainage, yes, we've had an extensive study about the water that crosses the site and also what's underneath this parking lot. And there is infrastructure under this parking lot that has been considered before we proposed the site, and it actually caused us to have to redesign the exact placement of the building to take that into consideration. And if I forgot anything, tell me now. Yeah.
Not at all.
Okay, thank you, Tracy, for answering so many questions, and thank you, Jade, for providing them for good discussion. And I see some more hands up. Mr. Miller, you've had your hand up for a while. Can I call on you?
Sure, thank you. Most of these questions are for staff. In September, of course, Member Hanson, Member Rosen, and myself weren't on the board. Did the board at that time see any sort of plan of the proposal, or was it just a sort of a conceptual idea discussed at that time? That's question number one. Question number two is another one regarding parking. Is there a formal code mechanism to reduce the parking to 110 spaces as proposed, given that it looks like in 1994, the city council approved the number of 146. While I don't disagree that there's certainly enough parking in the general area to accommodate significant uses of the museum and the museum site in other venues like street parking and the garages, I just wonder if there's a formal mechanism, or does there need to be a formal mechanism to do that reduction? And then just a comment on CEQA, California Environmental Equality Act, for those members that might not be quite so familiar with it. You've noted section 15331, the historic resource exemption, which doesn't seem to cover new structures, although you may take a broader approach to that exemption. I'm wondering if you also might want to look at 15303, the new construction of small structures. I know what we did in my professional work, we often loaded up the exemptions with more than one just to make any CEQA determination more defensible. I don't know that there's going to be any strong objection to this ultimately going forward, but you may want to look at whether or not it makes sense to also add 15303, just to comment on that. That's my only questions.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lyon, did you have any response to any of those that Mr. Miller presented, or?
Sure. I am remiss to have provided in your staff or in your packet today what you had reviewed in September, but to the best of my knowledge, it was a conceptual idea that the museum would place this building in this particular location. The reason it's coming back to you today is because the actual design of the sculpture garden has been now further articulated. So at the time that this went through the board in September, it was really more around the conceptual idea of taking part of the parking lot and using it for the creation of a sculpture garden for the Illuminaire house. But it was not a specific site plan that they were reviewing at that time. With regard to the question on is there a mechanism in the ordinances for doing a reduction in parking, this is a bit of an unusual case. We normally are looking at a particular zone designation rather than a planned development district designation. So when the museum was originally developed and evaluated by the council in the mid-90s, when the PD was placed on this particular parcel, they made the determination, and I was not able to find anything in the historic city council minutes as to how they came to the determination that that was an appropriate number. I suspect it was really the maximum number of spaces that could be accommodated on the site based on the parking design standards of the city's ordinances. So there is not a specific mechanism that I would call to your attention, other than generally, if we were looking at something where there was a request for a development to occur in which the parking was less than required by the ordinance, we would typically look at something like a variance or what is called an administrative minor modification to consider or evaluate a reduction in parking that would be required as a result of a development application. With respect to CEQA, we identified this because it is an alteration to a historic resource. That's why we chose 15303, not because of the introduction of a new structure, but in this case, because of the potential impact to the existing historic resource.
Good. Thank you. Other questions, Mr. Kaiser?
I think because this has become so big in this parking lot, I think it would behoove the board to do what we've done in the past and put together a subcommittee to work with these people and to hear the architects out, hear the museum out, not do this as a group because it's too complicated. We're being presented with something which we really don't understand. And we have Tracy trying to answer all these questions. We should have people from the museum board, the architecture, the architects, and people from our committee, our board, as a group to help understand this and allow us to make a decision on this, because I don't have enough information to vote on this.
Thank you, Mr. Kaiser. That's a very valid comment for certain. And Member Hanson, you've had your hand up too. Oops, unmute. Unmute yourself. Thank you.
Sorry. I think Board Member Kaiser's idea is a good one. I was actually going to suggest something along those lines, but I did want to also clarify with staff again that, again, we're looking at this project within the context of impacts to the museum as a Class 1 historic site and not the details of the design necessarily of this in and of itself. Correct? I mean, that doesn't mean there can't be some interaction with board members who have some, thoughtful recommendations, if you will, for maybe how elements of the design can be improved. But technically, is that within the purview of this board? Some of those details?
Well, yes, it is. The consideration of this, the proposal, the concept of placing the Luminaire House on the museum's parcel is what was considered at the September meeting, the concept of placing it there. This meeting and the review and the presentation today is for the board to evaluate the actual design and materials and other components of this proposed design and determine if it's appropriate.
Okay, it just seemed to me that some of the details, for example, you know, which tree was put in is not something that would have a material impact. It may be good ideas, but there's not really a material impact on the museum itself as a historical resource. But anyway, I agree with Mr. Kaiser that a subcommittee might work in this instance.
Okay. All right. Any other questions, discussion points? Mr. Nelson? Mr. Nelson, unmute, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Just a question for staff. So by the act of the Illuminaire House going on to this site, which is a Class 1 historic site and includes the entire parcel, does that in effect make it also a Class 1 site, or would it have to have a separate nomination for historic designation as a separate Class 1 site?
Class 1 designation or Class 2 designation is associated with a parcel. So when you look at any kind of a designation that is granted by the city council, it's associated with a parcel, usually with an address and certainly with an assessor parcel number. On that particular parcel, there are items that are identified as being historic resources. In this instance, the museum building itself is the historic resource, which would also include the subterranean sculpture garden that is an integral part of the museum building. So if this building were, with the Illuminaire House being placed on the museum site, it would be recognized as a historically significant resource on the site. It would not be granted its own separate historic designation per se.
Thank you. The reason I ask is because obviously when the designation was made, the Illuminaire was not there. So I would think by nature of this application and the work that we're doing now, that somehow you would have to go back to that designation and add in the Illuminaire as being an important historic resource on that site that is also a contributor because it's become part of the museum's collection, and because of its association with Albert Frey, I do think that there's probably some justification to include that language in the designation.
That's certainly a good point, Member Nelson, and I will evaluate that question further with Director Fagg. It might make sense that there be actually a consent item placed on the City Council agenda to include this as a character defining feature or a historic resource on that parcel. But I will speak with Director Fagg further on whether that's an action that we should take in this regard. It's a good point.
Great, thank you.
Good, thank you. Mr. Rose, you had your hand. Yes.
Unmute, please.
Unmute. Mr. Rose, unmute.
There we go.
Start again.
It's my first meeting. I might be confused, but my understanding, at least from Mr. Lyon, was that we already voted this voted that the Illuminaire was going to be a part of the museum where it is, and this motion and this consideration was about the proposed landscape design, correct?
Not just the landscape design, but the actual design of the sculpture garden. So including the walls and the landscape and the ground cover and so on.
Okay, so then any sort of select subcommittee would be to analyze the design and the placement. And so it would be more, it would be about the design elements, not the fact that this was already voted to be there as a part of the museum, correct?
I'm sorry, I was getting only a fraction of that. Your streaming is a little, it's like we have a bad connection, but could you restate that, please, Member Rose?
Yes.
Now,
My question is the select?
Okay, I understand that it's our position as the board to evaluate the plan that is presented to us, to evaluate, study the plan, and is it appropriate to move forward? So our mission is to evaluate, look, study the plan that is presented, and determine if it's appropriate to proceed. So perhaps having a subcommittee to do that task is the appropriate way to go. I'm in favor of that. If all agree, is that appropriate? For the appropriate?
But before you make that decision, could I please just say that
Yes.
the only review that the city asked us to go through was the Historic Site Preservation Board last September. And based on the certificate of appropriateness that we received in September, we proceeded to detail out plans. We are more than willing to accept all your suggestions or conditions in terms of the actual plan, but to now go back and re-adjudicate whether or not this is, fits with the museum or whatever the scope of you envision for the subcommittee seems a bit unfair as we've proceeded for the last year based on this rather than placing the Illuminaire at the COD campus. And we are completely open to all of Member Nelson's suggestions. If you want to suggest that we should study eliminating more parking or less parking, we can do that. But this sort of plan articulates what the architects feel is the best way to show off this building, and it is envisioned to be the centerpiece of the sculpture garden as if it is a sculpture. I think it's that we're going to have to start over again or re-adjudicate seems unfair, and will slow down the process, which has already been slow because the plan has had to have re-engineering for the hydrology issues, and also for this more extensive presentation, which was not originally envisioned in September.
Thank you. Mr. Lyon.
The question before the board is not to reconsider whether or not the certificate of appropriateness is appropriate for the placement of the Illuminaire House on the museum campus. That decision has already been made. Your evaluation today is to determine whether the now articulated final design for the sculpture garden is appropriate. My only comment that I want to have the board consider, if you choose to move this to a subcommittee, the full board needs to be ready then to delegate its decision and approval authority on the design of this particular project to that subcommittee. Similarly, I want to just give you an example. When you considered the certificate of appropriateness for the outdoor dining area and the terrace that went into the El Patron restaurant at the Oasis Commercial Building, which is a Class 1 historic site, the decision was to allow it to proceed, but the board assigned a subcommittee to work out the details of the railing design. So I think there needs to be, for today, a general concurrence that the full board is ready to say that this is appropriate in its current design, but that certain details could be further smoothed out or articulated via a subcommittee. But I believe it's appropriate for the full board to weigh in and make a decision via a motion to accept the design, but then allow a subcommittee to work through whatever specific details the board is still concerned about.
Mhm. Member Hanson?
Yes, I just wanted to concur with Mr. Lyon, and that would certainly be my intent with a subcommittee, not to be starting from scratch and going through all of the details of this design. I do concur with the staff report that the design as presented does not materially impact the site as a historical resource in Palm Springs. And I would, if there is consensus to have a subcommittee, that again, it would just be to iron out some of the minor details and maybe listen to some, alternate opinions and suggestions, but certainly not to rehash the entire design, to be starting from scratch, and certainly, hopefully not to slow this project down. I think it's a really important project. So I'm prepared to accept the design with the subcommittee to iron out some specific details, but I don't know if we would need to agree on those today, but some of them are very specific. So I'm not sure I could get into that level of detail personally. I think maybe one of the larger suggestions was the walls matching the existing, and I'm actually fine with Ms. Conrad's explanation of the differentiation per the Secretary of the Interior standards.
One more question from Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose, unmute. There.
Yeah, I would agree that the minor details can be worked out, heavy on the minor. They've worked very hard for a year, to present what I found to be a pretty amazing design plan. And, we can't get bogged down and lose the big picture, and that's to get the luminaire there, which we're all proud to have. So
Good.
I would vote for the minor details subcommittee as well.
Okay. Mr. Nelson?
Yes, I don't disagree with the sentiments just presented by Member Hanson and Member Rose. However, this is before us because we are the Historic Site Preservation Board, and this is a Class 1 site. And this is an important building and an important addition, not only to the museum, but to our downtown and to our cultural heritage tourism. It's important that it be done right with the input and expertise and background and history and passion of all of those present. I think it will make it a better project in the end, and I know most of us agree with that. I think the discussion is really worth having, and this is the time to do it, whether the new wall should match the existing. The 3 other walls are being made based on the height of the existing south wall. And you kind of have to think, because this is a site taken from another place, from back east, predates Albert Frey's desert language. It predates his desert modernism. He didn't use concrete blocks in New York. He used them in the desert. But the south wall wasn't designed by Frey. It was designed by William to encapsulate the entire site. So that was one reason why I had mentioned the new 3 walls should possibly match, because Frey isn't here today. He's not building the 3 new walls. So plus I believe that the 3 new walls, if they matched the existing south wall and the west wall of the delivery driveway or the loading dock access, it would relate better to the site as a whole. And that's what we're talking about today, the entire parcel being a Class 1 historic site. So I think it's important not to lose sight of that. Also, some of the parking spaces are very, very close to the proposed new walls. And I worry that concrete block would be more vulnerable than a solid wall would be. So I think it's worth having the discussion now amongst all of us on whether we believe there should be a block wall or a rubbed solid concrete wall, or whether we defer that to the subcommittee if we so choose to have one.
So, yes, Mr. Lyon.
Just a point of clarification, my staff report was written on the assumption that the new walls were going to be a continuation of the same poured in place concrete, rubbed concrete wall that we see currently on the south wall. And in terms of discussion of the Secretary of the Interior standards, this can go both ways. You can either do a material that differentiates, or you can document the file and identify that this is a material that is designed to completely replicate and match that of the historic wall, but that the archival record will demonstrate and identify that this was something that was added in 2021 or 2022, with the purposes of keeping the material integrity of the site consistent. So you can take the Secretary of the Interior standards in both ways on that particular question. But my staff
We're happy to match.
understanding that it was, I'm sorry.
Ken, we're happy to match. And you and I had a conversation, and I'm sorry that the plan reflects the precision block.
Yeah.
We can match the walls. That's just not a
That was
problem.
what
Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Rose.
I think if the last few years have taught us anything, we should all try to reach a consensus on building the wall. Anyway, just had to say that. I would agree that we match it.
Okay. So is it my understanding that we're all agreeing that we do want to grant the certificate of appropriateness with the idea of setting up a subcommittee that would work out, certain details, in conjunction and representing our board on the decision to finalize and move this forward? Is that my feeling of what we're discussing here? Are we all pretty much in agreement for that? Mr. Miller?
I would just add, and I'll defer to Member Nelson to clarify if I've spoken out of turn here, but I would say we need to mention that the goal of that subcommittee, and perhaps in limiting its scope, is certainly to better integrate this large piece of sculpture into the Class 1 site and maintaining as much congruity, I guess, in terms of materials and colors, because this aluminum structure is going to be incongruous with the design of the desert colors on the museum, of course. So I think all that can be done to better integrate it into the site as a whole is worthwhile. But I agree that that can be done simply with 3 people talking about it and working that out with the architect and with the Illuminaire group and with the art museum. And it doesn't need to come back for any formal action to this full board.
Mm-hmm. So may I have a motion to that effect? Mr. Nelson?
Yeah, so I would so move that we make a motion with amendment to approve the application by the Illuminaire House Foundation on behalf of the Palm Springs Art Museum for alteration to the museum, a Class 1 historic site, with a 3-person subcommittee to iron out some of the details that have been brought up by various board members, but also to include in that motion that the new wall will match the existing south wall, that the outdated circular seating by the flagpoles also be removed, as the applicant has agreed would be a good idea, and that the gravel surrounding the structure be in fact the Mojave gold and not the gray graphite as agreed upon by the applicant that for A would definitely be more in favor of something natural. And then the other detail could be worked out by the subcommittee.
I second that motion.
Okay, so I have a motion by Mr. Nelson, a second by Mr. Rose to grant that certificate of appropriateness with the committee and all those details that were mentioned in that motion. And I think, Mr. Lyon, you probably captured those, the motion. And so is there any other discussion regarding that motion? Mr. Lyon?
I would like to just make sure that I understand with Mr. Nelson's motion and the details that he clarified, which, by the way, that's a very appropriate way of doing this, is to identify with your motion as many facets of this design that the current group of you feel is appropriate, and then leave the specific finite items that you want the subcommittee to further address to be addressed. And to that end, the only question that I would like some clarification on, there was some discussion about the actual dimensional characteristics of this sculpture garden as being roughly 90 by 95. Am I correct in understanding that the board is accepting that particular dimensional characteristic of this sculpture garden, and that the other details such as the planting material and things like that are what are going to be worked out by the subcommittee?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Yeah, well, if the parking could be eliminated, then which doesn't look like it's going to happen, then I would, want to change that dimension. But that's dependent upon, having the parking laid out as it is now. Mr. Nelson?
Yes, I would just like to ask if Mr. Miller, given his previous experience with urban planning and so forth, had any further comment on the logistics of the parking, especially as applied to the area to the west, directly behind the Illumina, because since this isn't going to Planning Commission, and we don't really have somebody here who's an expert in parking or parking lot design. Yeah, based on Mr. Miller's experience and perhaps staff member Lyon's experience, and maybe Director Fagg, if he cares to comment, if that area immediately to the west looks fine, if there any need to have it further addressed. I believe that, they've hired an engineering firm and an architect who's probably pretty savvy and all that, but I just wanted to see if anyone here on the board had one last thing to say, if they studied that, if they thought, it was okay or not.
So
I'll let Member Miller speak first.
I did actually look at that situation based on the angle, and it is a little bit tight, but it appears that it will meet the standard dimensions based on that angle. It's possible that southernmost space may need more than one motion to get in and out of, but I would say generally it meets the criteria for parking standards, although albeit on a little bit tight in terms of its dimensions, but I think it'll be fine.
And in terms of the staff evaluation of it, the very last or southernmost space, which is currently shown in your staff report as being at the same angle, the same angled parking as the rest of the existing parking spaces to remain. We have already been speaking with the engineering group on the redesign of this parking lot. And the one thing that we have recommended that they do in terms of the design of the parking lot is that southernmost space be a direct drive in rather than being at an angle, so that last space, or maybe even the last two spaces, don't require excessive maneuverability in order to get in and out of the space. And furthermore, so that when you are backing out of the space, that you're not banging into the new proposed sculpture garden wall. So we've already provided those comments to the engineering firm, as well as the requirements of the city's parking ordinance in terms of spaces, dimensions, and things like that. As far as our understanding of the area west of the proposed sculpture garden, our understanding from speaking with Mrs. Conrad is that the area there is primarily for loading and unloading. If there are any surviving or existing parking spaces that are residual that are left over with the creation of the sculpture garden, those would, our presumption is that those would be established as you mentioned, staff spaces for the museum, but they're not necessarily intended to be public parking spaces for the patrons of the museum. So we've looked at those things and we are comfortable with those comments that I've just made, that the design of the parking structure, the parking area functions adequately. And furthermore, our understanding in terms of that loading area is that the design of it has been reviewed with the museum administrative staff, and they are comfortable with its functionality.
Mr. Nelson.
Thank you for the very, very, very helpful comment, Ken. Much appreciated. You answered exactly what I wanted, but I just had one other thought looking at the plan. Forgive me, but my thought was, where does the trash go? Will there be a dumpster immediately behind the building in that small parking area to the west, or will it be taken further out into the area?
Down loading dock. That's down the loading dock. You know, the loading dock is the further west area, and that's that runs parallel. So don't worry about the trash. Okay, so we have a motion. Oh, and we have a second, but I see, Ken, is that your hand up?
No, Mr. Rose has a question.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, Mr. Rose.
I just would like to offer as a part of the motion that we identify the subcommittee.
Oh, yeah.
I'm very passionate about this. I am very passionate about the Illuminaire. As many of you know, I helped bring the Walk Guest House here. So this is something that's important to me. And I would say, why don't we, Mr. Miller and myself, be a part of the subcommittee, and we can further analyze the thing with Mr. Long and work out some of the minor details.
Okay, so the recommendation is for the subcommittee to include Mr. Nelson, Mr. Miller, Mr. Rose, correct?
Yes.
Okay, you agree to that with your motion, Mr. Nelson?
Sure,
Okay.
sure.
And you second, right, Mr. Rose? You had second.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we have the motion. Any other discussion? Can we call for? Can we raise our hands? All in favor, say aye.
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 Okay, so any opposed? So the motion passes 7-0. Thank you very much. Okay, wow, that was fun.
And if it was easy, it wouldn't just be having anybody do this, but
I
it
know.
would be this qualified group to consider these questions.
Yes, yeah.
Good debate, all of you.
So good discussion, and thank you, Tracy, also for your input. Very, very valuable. So let us proceed to agenda discussion item number 5A. And this is the 2022 Preservation Matters Symposium. And I would like to give you a very brief report. A new subcommittee has been established consisting of board members, including myself, Jade Nelson and Dan Kaiser, along with Dick Perquette, who serves as a non-board member advisory to this subcommittee. We met with Ken Lyon on June 23 to begin discussing ideas for the 2022 symposium. We are currently compiling a list of presentation topics and on-site tours. Should anyone have suggestions, please let one of us know right away. Our next meeting is scheduled for July 15th. to continue discussing these ideas we're compiling these work lists and assignments. We're really moving forward. We have a lot to follow because the last few years the symposium has been fantastic, and boy, we have our work cut out for us to achieve that excellence. So we're working hard. We also have a September 16 meeting scheduled to include Deborah and Richard Hovel, who do handle the production, and we want to get them involved very early. Mr. Lyon is looking into convention center availability. We're talking about April 2022 for this symposium. It looks like April 2 or 3 is a maybe. April 9 or 10 is not available, nor is the 16th or the 17th, which is the Easter weekend. April 23, 24 is the second weekend of Coachella Music Fest. And the convention center may be available that weekend. So we are looking into options. And I don't know if Mr. Lyon, would you like to add anything to those possibilities?
Yes, only I did reach out to the convention center and you did characterize the availability correctly. However, the city manager's office and the convention center have asked that we coordinate, that all departments coordinate our requests for use of the convention center through the city manager's office. And so I have basically turned the request over to the city manager's office. And there were some questions that were coming from that office with respect to whether or not the symposium needs to happen in April, given that April is a very, very busy month in Palm Springs. And so I wanted to let you know that that question was kind of returned back to me from the city manager's office. And as you recall, your symposium originally began as the board participating in the National Historic Preservation Month, which occurs in May. And that we moved it to April because people that were taking the site tours in May were finding it to be very, very hot. The weather by May is starting to get pretty warm here in Palm Springs. And so that was what drove the event to being scheduled in April. Mm-hmm. So the city manager's office is asking us that question. So as I know more about what what are the competing events that people are asking for April, I may need to come back to the subcommittee and to the board in general and look at some other possible dates for the symposium.
Very good. Thank you very much. So that completes today's agenda. Are there any comments from the board?
I just had a question on the last item. When does the rest of the board get more information on the content of the symposium as it starts shaping up?
September is our goal. Over the summer, we're working on compiling ideas and lists and prioritizing them and seeing, what's available, what's feasible, what's timely, especially with the tours that Mr. Kaiser's working on. And of course, the heat was a problem. It can be a problem in May for those tours. So again, I want to stress that if any member has ideas of topics, please, pass them on to us, because we're going to be working on ideas and compiling those lists the next 2 months in the summertime and kind of pulling a draft together by September. So that's how that's working out. Any other board comments? Mr. Rose?
I just want to give a shout out to Ken and the staff. This is my first board meeting. The packet that I was given and the amount of work that's put in really makes our job so much easier. You just do just a spectacular job, and I'm proud to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Other board comments? Mr. Nelson?
Yes, I too would like to welcome Mr. Rowe to the HSPB. Looking forward to having you working with us, in addition to Scott and Janet, who are newly arrived. And I would just like to doubly stress what Chair Huff said about ideas. I think it would be great to hear from all of you. So let Dan or Catherine or myself know if you have an idea or something where you can bring your expertise, or if you participated in a similar type of event or conference or seminar in the past and you knew of something that worked or was an audience favorite. We'd love to know all about that, because obviously this is, you know, the 7th or 8th symposium. Maybe we're higher up than that now. So we're looking for ways to change it up and make it engaging and fun and keep it exciting. And on that note, my suggestion would be, if the city manager and convention center are concerned about an April date, to maybe look at a March date, just for the sake of being able to do the outdoor party at the O'Donnell at the end of the day, and also the tours, because our visitors who come to this event, whether they're local or from outside the city, they really appreciate that cooler weather. And then we could rebroadcast it via the city's YouTube channel in May during National Preservation Month. We could have a whole separate push, like a campaign. Hey, it's National Preservation Month, come watch our event any day in May. So on that note, I did have a couple things. One is left over from last month's meeting, and it was my mention of some possible work that might happen at Bank of America. And I know that staff is aware of it, and they're going to make us aware, but I know that we're dark in the month of August. So I just wanted to make sure that if anything was going to come forward from B of A, there are several people in the community who are very concerned about it, especially the modernists, that maybe if it's being handled at a staff level, since we're dark and we won't be able to hear it for over a month, if you could just keep us in the loop about it. Otherwise, it'd be great to see it on the agenda in September. And then finally, I'm going to close out with something that I've seen regarding a classroom site that's a little bothersome. As many of you may know, Invernada recently sold for over $5 million. It is a classroom site. It's a beautiful 1930 Spanish colonial revival, certainly one of the gems of our city. And they have removed all of the exterior vegetation that's growing on the wall. And, you know, we were talking earlier about historic sites being the parcels. So this is a whole parcel of land that takes up its own island, its own block. And that wall is part of the parcel, and that vegetation was growing all over that wall for years. And now they're putting up paint samples on the wall. And I've always known that wall to be natural, exposed, gray block. And so I was just wondering if, you know, staff had heard anything about this, and if we're going to be receiving an application for a certificate of appropriateness regarding this house, because it is very, very important that we stay on top of it. And just before I leave you, on that note, there's another house nearby in Toshiba by Howard Lapham, right across from Catherine Finchy. That's not a class 1 site, but I believe it is a class 3. And they have recently removed a giant tree, a giant eucalyptus tree, and also a whole row of Italian cypress. And I bring this up because these things are in front of the house. They are, you know, visible from the street. They are part of the facade. They are part of our purview of what we include in the designation as a character defining feature that can be seen from the street. And landscape often plays a role in that. So those are my concerns, and I'll leave you with that.
Good. Thank you so much. Any other comments from the board? Any other comments? So does staff have any comments?
Yes, thank you. Just a couple. We have had contact from the Bank of America, and they are beginning to put together their proposed scope of work. They don't have it delineated yet. I have forwarded to their representative many things from our historic archives on that building, including many of the original photos. Those of you who are familiar with the building know that there was an extraordinary aluminum sunscreen on the west facade that's been gone for many, many years, and that there was a rather unique blue mosaic tile fountain on the northwest corner of the building that was also removed many, many years ago. When the building went through a repaint a couple of years ago, they consulted with staff, and we consulted with the contractor who did the repaint, and we acknowledged that we kind of missed the mark on the gray color paint. So we're working with them to get the gray accent color into something that's more closely resembles the original paint color from the photographs that we have of the building. With respect to the other site that you mentioned on Invernada, we'll try to reach out to the new owners if we can find their addresses and information, and remind them that it is a Class 1 site and that alterations to the site are also part of the consideration of historic preservation review.
Thank you.
Let me see if there is something else here. I think that's it. The only other thing that I wanted to make the board aware of, you know that in the past, excuse me, staff has done education outreach to the local real estate board. And I've done that a few times, doing PowerPoint presentations and explaining the ordinance revisions that occurred in 2019 and again in 2020. And I have updated my PowerPoint presentation on that, and I'll be reaching out to the real estate board to schedule some meetings with them again to update them on how the ordinance works and how Class 3 works and how demos work and the incentives available for historic preservation. I'll kind of go through the whole thing, and I will try to actually, maybe if I've got time at one of the upcoming meetings, I'll give you a brief presentation for the board as well. The other little piece of outreach that I am doing, or I have done, city staff puts together what is called a City Beat, which is a little online newsletter that goes to city staff. And I was asked to write a brief item about historic preservation. And so I will share that with you as well once Denise Goolsby has it printed. But I basically gave an explanation of how the historic preservation ordinance began. And so I'll share that with you once I've got that document published. And I think that's it in terms of staff comments. Director Fagg, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I don't have any items for discussion this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Will we be meeting in City Hall in September?
We believe so. We're looking for direction from the city council on that. We believe it's going to, as the COVID numbers and everything seem to continue to improve, it does appear that we will be meeting back in person, but we'll be taking that direction from the city council. I also, I'm sorry, this is like the Alzheimer's round, as we always talk about it in planning department meeting. The other thing that I did want to update you on is, if you recall at one of the past meetings, I believe in May, you considered alterations that are occurring or that have occurred at the 1350 Ladera Circle house, which is otherwise known as the Robert Alexander House of Tomorrow. So we have the Historic Resources report in draft form that I'm going to be reviewing this coming week. The applicant and the homeowner on that particular site are, of course, eager for us to move this through the process of bringing it back to the board on a public hearing, and then to obviously get it to the city council for a public hearing as promptly as possible. And to that end, I will possibly be reaching out to you in the coming weeks to determine if the board has any availability to possibly hold a meeting in August in order to consider that item. They have not requested that yet, but I am anticipating that they're going to be pushing hard to try to get the city to move through its process of public hearings on that particular item as quickly as we can. So if that request does come through, I will be reaching out to the board members to see if you are available and able to make a special meeting, possibly in October.
August.
I'm sorry, August. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that heads up. Because we do plan our vacations around board meetings. So Mr. Nelson.
Yeah, just one more question for staff. If you don't have the answer now, maybe you could just email it to us. But I just wanted clarification on the date that the historic preservation ordinance went into effect, and also the date that the first historic site preservation board was sacked. Because I'm trying to determine if it's a 40th anniversary or 45th anniversary or whatever, because I think it would be great to have that number.
So if I'm correct, you want to know the date that the ordinance was passed, and then you want to know the date of the first HSPB meeting.
Correct.
Okay. The first one I'm certain I can find. The second one might be less different, but less easy, but I will do my best to see what we've got.
Thank you.
Sure.
Very good. Okay. Mr. Rose. Unmute, please.
Yeah.
Mute. You're still on mute.
I think it's not mute. I think he's having a streaming problem.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
His screen is frozen.
It's a story, but anyway. Is it better now?
A little bit. Can you repeat what you had asked?
Can you hear me?
You're coming in and out.
Yeah. Anyway.
Send a chat. Send a chat.
Okay.
You want to send it as a chat?
Yeah, chat. Where'd he go?
I think we might have lost his connection. Let's see if he joins us again.
Okay, well, seeing no other discussion, I would like to
There he's back.
Okay. Okay, seeing no other discussion, this meeting of the Historic Site Preservation Board is adjourned at 7:27 to the meeting of September 14th, 2021 at 5:30. Please note that that meeting date was adjusted due to the holiday. So please take note of that, and then we'll find out if we have an August meeting, if we need to have that. So we'll be all in touch. And I want to thank all of you for your participation today, and to welcome Mr. Rose. It was a wonderful meeting, and really appreciate all the time and effort and research and thoughts that you put into each and every item, including Mr. Nelson. So thanks to all, and best wishes for the rest of the summer. So we'll say goodbye. Bye-bye.